Well, as many of you may know, we find ourselves now in our Torah readings right in the middle of the story of Joseph and his brothers, one of the great narratives in world literature about which scholars have made a variety of comments about how artfully this story was presented and with what suspense. And our Torah portion for this Shabbat commences with Pharaoh having dreams. And you may recall that there are 3 sets of dreams in the Joseph story. In a certain way, they are the scaffolding of this narrative. Joseph has 2 of them at the beginning, and you may remember he tells his brothers and his father about the dreams, and it enrages them. Now we had the butler and the baker who were in prison with Joseph and told Joseph their dreams, and Joseph interpreted them. And now Pharaoh has his pair of dreams. And in the first dream, Pharaoh pictures 7 very robust and healthy cows coming up out of the Nile, and they graze in the grass. And immediately thereafter, 7 emaciated, weak, sick cows come up and consume the 7 healthy cows. And this startles Pharaoh, and he wakes up and he wonders exactly what is going on here. But it's only halfway through the night, and so Pharaoh goes back to sleep, and lo and behold, he has another dream which is parallel to the first. There are 7 ears of stalks of grain, healthy, robust, that come up, and immediately thereafter, 7 emaciated stalks of grain come up and consume the healthy corn, the healthy stalks. And now Pharaoh is terrified. This dream, same kind of dream, has happened to him right at one after the other. And so Pharaoh calls for his magicians and he calls for his wise people to come and offer an interpretation of this dream. And the Torah says, "Ve'ein potero tam leFaro," and they have no interpretation for Pharaoh. Well, that makes some sense, although the story is now ground to a preliminary halt. But the great commentator Rashi notices some problem here. And Rashi says, "You mean to tell me the magicians and the wise people had no interpretation whatsoever? Wouldn't they have offered something to the Pharaoh?" And Rashi contrives what it is they might have said to Pharaoh on the assumption that certainly they had something to say, and here might have been what they told him. They interpreted the dreams, and Pharaoh was dissatisfied with their interpretation. For they would say, 7 daughters will you beget, and 7 daughters will you bury. Okay? In other words, how Pharaoh understood what he saw in the dream had to be suitable for him. Notice Rashi's subtlety. Yes, they gave an interpretation for Pharaoh, but they give an interpretation for Pharaoh, an interpretation that would resonate with him. And therefore we can draw an inference here that mere hearing, is not yet understanding. Understanding comes through some interpretation. And I want to suggest to you that understanding has 2 elements, an objective element and a subjective element. Suppose the magicians in their interpretation had said 8 cows came up, healthy and full, and then 8 emaciated cows came up. Well, this would have been a factual misunderstanding of Pharaoh's dream. They got that right. they, they got the facts of the matter right, but according to Rashi's interpretations, the magicians didn't find an interpretation that was right for Pharaoh. In other words, Pharaoh certainly didn't want to face the death of his children, and therefore he would have pushed away, and not taken seriously this kind of interpretation. And it's at that moment that Pharaoh and his men call for Joseph, because the butler and the baker had told the Pharaoh in the meantime that Joseph is pretty good at interpreting dreams. Thereupon Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was rushed from the dungeon. He had his hair cut and changed his clothes. He appeared before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I have had a dream, but no one can interpret it. Now I have heard it said that you can hear a dream and tell its meaning." And Joseph answered Pharaoh and said, "It is not I, but God who will interpret the dream." In the Hebrew, Pharaoh says, "I've heard about you, Lemor, tishma," from the word shema, to hear. "I have heard that you can hear a dream and interpret it," as if the interpretation follows directly from the hearing. And so Pharaoh misunderstands that gap between hearing and understanding. Understanding requires fidelity to the facts, and this is what I think is crucial, and what the person who needs the interpretation needs to hear. What the recipient of the interpretation is going to get something of what he or she needs, something acceptable to him or her, something relevant to this particular person at this particular time. And if that interpretation is not suitable for Pharaoh, then however true or profound it may be, it will not be heard by Pharaoh. It has to be relevant to the person and to the person's situation. It's not straightforward, as the Pharaoh says, that you hear it and you interpret it, as if one flows naturally from the other. And in fact, Joseph's interpretation precisely fits what Pharaoh needs and what he is willing to accept. Some predicted sequence of events that are going to have a great impact on Pharaoh's country and on Pharaoh's reign. And so Joseph gives him the interpretation that he needs. And here's what's canny about Joseph. It's the interpretation that he needs as well. Chapter 41, continuing. And Joseph said to Pharaoh, Pharaoh's dreams are one and the same. God has told Pharaoh what he's about to do. The 7 healthy cows are 7 years, and the 7 healthy years are 7 years. It's the same dream. The 7 lean and ugly cows that followed are 7 years, and also the 7 empty ears scorched by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine. It is just as I have told Pharaoh. God has revealed, notice how adroit this is. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do, throwing the weight of the divine behind that creative interpretation. Immediately ahead, Joseph goes on, are 7 years of great abundance in all the land of Egypt. After them will come 7 years of famine, and all the abundance in the land of Egypt will be forgotten. As the land is ravished by famine, no trace of the abundance will be left in the land because of the famine thereafter, for it will be very severe. As for Pharaoh having had the same dream twice, it means that the matter has been determined by God, and God will soon carry it out. Accordingly, Joseph doesn't stop there. Accordingly, let Pharaoh find a man of discernment and wisdom and set him over the land of Egypt. Joseph has already demonstrated his discernment and wisdom by his creative interpretation of Pharaoh's dream meant for Pharaoh. Thereupon, Pharaoh acts upon that interpretation, appointing Joseph to oversee the land. And so now we have opened up a tripartite sequence: hearing, interpretation, action. It all depends, doesn't it, on paying attention to what the person needs and what the person to whom the interpretation is given is willing to accept. Now, I want to suggest that there are very few general interpretations and general solutions suitable to everyone. If someone hears something and is asked to interpret it and offers some global interpretation, the particular individual who is seeking interpretation is likely not to pay any attention to it because it's not focused on that particular person's situation. When a person has a particular problem, the solution has a chance to work that will be right for him or for her. Now, let me be a bit autobiographical here. When I counsel a person, when a person comes to me with a problem, I first listen very carefully to what this person is saying to me. I try to hear. Then I consider saying to myself, how should I interpret this problem so as to be helpful to this person? But of course, I don't give a general interpretation of a general problem. I try to focus on the problem at hand and that will fit the facts of the person's situation, and that one that will make sense to that particular person with whom I am now speaking. And if I don't do this, then however brilliant my interpretation may be, if it's not relevant, if it doesn't make sense to the person, my interpretation will be stillborn. And so I've not done what I'm called to do. My goal is to try to persuade the person that this interpretation is relevant and makes sense so that this person can then take actions in order to try to resolve his or her problem. That is, to allow that person to go forward in the process of resolution. Hearing, interpreting, action. And Joseph, given Rashi's great insight, who gives an interpretation meant for Pharaoh, is able to enact all three of these moments. He hears, he interprets, and he encourages Pharaoh to act. Hearing alone is not enough. Well, let's think of the central word, Hebrew word, which we usually translate as hear, Shema. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. What is wanted here? What are we supposed to do when we hear that the Lord is one? Oh, yes, I got it. I hear this often. I know what it is. Yeah, I hear it. I understand that sentence. Let's go on to what comes next. Now, if the model that I've tried to put forward here has cogency, hearing the words is not enough. What is required is for us to interpret those words, not in a general theological sense, but an interpretation that is likely to work for me. In other words, the goal here is not to reach out to some universal, general interpretation of this, because then I may not have any inclination to enact what I have heard. So you have a right, having heard Shema Yisrael, to interpret it in your own way so that it is something that you can embrace. I have to ask myself, what can I accept here about God is one? What does it mean to me? What can it mean to me? And having noticed the gap between hearing and interpretation and called to make the interpretive move, I am now part of the process of relating myself to this idea more and more. What I can accept now may not be, upon reflection, what I will come to accept. What's important here is to enter into the process of understanding. And if I don't ask and answer these questions, all I have done, and if you're like me, you do this all the time, all I have done is have my ears receive the vibrations of those words. And perhaps I say yes to them. Yes. I say amen out of habit. Hearing is not enough. What am I saying amen yes to? Not to some general interpretation, but to an interpretation that is likely to resonate with me. And this, I think, is the challenge that emerges from our Torah portion as we apply it to the Shema Yisrael. You remember I just read that. Pharaoh said, when you hear, you interpret. And Pharaoh uses that word, tishma, when you hear. And so Pharaoh makes the mistake of thinking that there's almost no gap at all between hearing and understanding. But the gap is opened up by the need for a movement of my own. And having heard and having interpreted, I might want to make the third and final step in this sequence and to think how I might enact the claim that God is one. And our prayer book offers an interpretation, which I'm suggesting it lays before us for our active, ongoing consideration. If there is just one God, if there is just one transcendent being, then that God should be the source of our ultimate concern, our ultimate values, our ultimate worldview. And to have something as our ultimate concern is to, ipso facto, have a passion for it, a yearning for it, to want to love that for which we are reaching. And this is precisely what the prayer book says. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. That's an action. But then the prayer book goes on to say more. Impress them upon your children. Make it a regular part of the activities of your home. Recite them when you stay at home and when you are away, when you lie down and when you rise up. The sequence that I've uncovered in the Joseph story is the sequence of one of the centerpieces of the prayer book. hearing the Shema, interpreting it, recognizing that the one God is the object of my love. As I move toward it, I embrace God and the meaning of God more and more in my own way. You interpret it in your way, not necessarily in my way, though I love my way. And then the V'ahavta, the rabbis placed that right there is a call to action. Here then is the prayer book's summons to us, that hearing is not enough. It wasn't enough for Joseph. It isn't enough for us. True hearing will lead to an interpretation I can accept for myself, which will then lead to actions that put what I have heard, what I have embraced, into action. If we don't do something like this with the centerpiece of our religion, then we will have left behind, untended to, Judaism's greatest revolution, its greatest and most profound insight, and its greatest opportunity to transform our lives.